Hello, this is Graham, and welcome to this Creative Writing 3 presentation, all about using imagery. The idea here is to talk about how to create images and use images in your creative writing. That's on question 5 on both papers. Obviously, because it's about imagery, it also has quite a bit of relevance to the language analysis questions. That's question 2 on paper 1 and question 3 on paper 2. So straight away, let's get into looking at some language. We're going to consider this poem, which was by an American poet who wrote in the early 20th century, called William Carlos Williams. It's a very short poem. We'll read it through a couple of times. Have a think about what pictures it brings to your mind. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. It's very short, but there's quite a bit there to think about. So let's read it again. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. Think about those words. What do you see in your mind's eye? What image comes to mind? Perhaps it was something like this. This is something like what most of the people I've done this poem with have come up with. For me, I'd like to see the wheelbarrow a bit more red and perhaps shiny from the glazed from the rainwater. But in its general nature, that's fairly it, isn't it? A farmyard, a field, the red wheelbarrow, the white chickens. A nice little image. Now, think about this. How has the writer put that image in your mind? How has the writer put that image in your mind? How does it go from the words to a picture? Think about that. Don't worry about coming up with an answer just yet. We'll come back to it at the end. So why do writers use imagery? Why should you use imagery in your writing? Well, imagery is vivid, descriptive language that appeals to one or more of our senses. The senses being sight, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting. These are the senses we use to make sense of our world. In fact, they are the senses that we use to know our world. The picture of the reality around us comes through these senses. So if a writer wants us to believe in what he or she has created on the page, they have to evoke or tease those particular parts of our mind that deal with those senses. They have to bring to life the reality, which is in fact only on the page, on the words, and in our imaginations. So imagery is about all the senses. I know that when we talk about an image, we usually mean a picture, but in writing, we're also talking about hearing, touching, smelling, and tasting, as well as the visual. Let's see some imagery in action now. And this is a story, a short story called The Race, that was written in response to this photograph. Just like on paper 1, question 5, you'll get a photograph or maybe a picture, a drawing to look at. It's usually a photograph. And in this case, the photograph seems to evoke mystery, suspense, a thriller, almost like a genre story, like a detective story or something like that. And that is what the student has written. Whilst we're reading it, try and think about the images that are being created and how the student has created them. Where was she? In what dark hole was she hiding? I had to find her. I had to find her before he found me. Suddenly I was running. Like a thief in the night with no hiding place, I flung myself through the maze of the old city. Alleyways and burrow holes twisted and stretched before me. It was as if I were inside the impossible body of an enormous hollow spider, lost in the legs as it crawled inexorably across the surface of its greedy web. I wondered who was crying, and then I realized it was me. Tears wet my face, and I could taste salt in my mouth. My breath came in gasps, audibly catching my throat, squeezing like his fingers were already around it. Mile after mile I ran, or seemed to. Overarching ruined passageways of seemingly infinite night offered no doors or windows to give me hope. I just had to run on, all the time straining to hear the slightest echo of footfall behind me, any indication that he was there and almost upon me. "Trust me, Steve," she'd said to me, weakening my resolve with an embrace, with a kiss. "Trust me." And now she is gone, down here somewhere, a dyed blonde Persephone in stilettos, sucked into this reeking underworld of smoke and drain covers. But where? A sound. Close to me, a figure moved in the shadows. A cat screamed. Only a cat? I froze, examining the darkness, straining my eyes. I couldn't hear the cat anymore, but then I saw it. It emerged from the blackness, hanging limply from a pair of leather-gloved hands. Its neck was broken. They were her woman's hands. "Olivia," I whispered, the walls of the passage rushing in on me. "Olivia." She stepped into the half-light, her face emerging lips first. There it was, the steely trap of her mouth, and the sweet slavery of her half-moon eyes. She opened her hands, and the cat slid to the floor, lying obediently dead at her feet, a pet for the afterlife. "You should have trusted me, Steve," she stated. There was no anger in her voice, no emotion at all. She was staring into my eyes, and I began to feel my world turning again. "I'm sorry," I started. But then I saw her gaze quickly flip behind me and her expression freeze. I started to turn, but the blow caught me on the nape of my neck, pitching me sideways and off my feet. Something hard had hit me, something really hard. I felt Olivia catch me and then let me go. I slid along the length of her, first her belly, then her thighs, and down to her feet. I saw the red leather of her high-heeled shoes. I breathed in their musty, new from the shop perfume. And then I was out, lying there on the concrete, lips to her shoe, beside the dead cat. When I awoke, it was still night. It was always night in these alleys. I was more alone than I'd been before. At least before I'd had the possibility of her. Now I knew she was gone. When I tried to move, the whole world tipped forward. I felt a surge of panic from the depths of my gut, like I was going to fall off into a pit. I had to steady myself with both hands, just to lie down there. I didn't want to slip. I didn't feel any pain, and that worried me even more than if I'd had. Perhaps I was too far gone for pain. Perhaps I was already dead. That would make sense, really. Being dead. Then this place was hell, with its winding architectural limbs and organs, its open stone mouths and masonry fangs. Somehow I got to my feet, but it didn't feel much different being up than lying down. Just a matter of perspective. I staggered off in any direction. Perhaps all of them. I wasn't running anymore, though. I'd already lost the race. Did you notice the imagery? Let's look at the second paragraph again. Suddenly I was running. Like a thief in the night with no hiding place, I flung myself through the maze of the old city. Alleyways and burrow holes twisted and stretched before me. It was as if I were inside the impossible body of an enormous hollow spider, lost in the legs as it crawled inexorably across the surface of its greedy web. Where are the images in this paragraph? Let's look for some key ones. So first of all, you have like a thief in the night with no hiding place. This is saying that the narrator feels lost in this city, nowhere to go, panicking over whether he can get away with whoever is chasing him. Like a thief, but not a thief, he feels he is being chased, he is under threat. A thief might be being chased because he's just stolen something from a house or a bank or something, and therefore the police are chasing him. And if the thief didn't have a hiding place, of course the thief would panic. That's how the image works. We think about the situation that the thief would be in, but actually we're thinking about the narrator, who is quite different from a thief, but is in a similar position. He flung himself through the maze of the old city. Now, a maze is a puzzle, isn't it? It's either something that's maybe drawn in a newspaper or a puzzle book, but can often be made of stone or hedges in a park or something. It's actually, you're meant to walk into it, and perhaps you get lost, you've got to find the center, or you've got to find your way out. It's a puzzle to be solved. Now, the city is not a puzzle. The image is created by one element of the maze, which is the confusion and the difficulty with which it is to be able to get round it. So he is getting himself lost in the city, as one might get lost in a maze. And then we get this last long piece, as if I were inside the impossible body of an enormous hollow spider, lost in the legs as it crawled inexorably across the surface of its greedy web. Now that's very long and very complicated. He's saying that he feels like he is inside a large, enormous spider. Not an ordinary spider, this one is hollow. That is, it doesn't, you are able to run around inside it. It's so big the man can be inside it, and he's running about in there, lost, unable to get out. The spider represents fear, represents death, represents horror. Being lost and enclosed inside the spider's body is a very claustrophobic feeling. And the spider itself is crawling across this surface of the greedy web. Inexorably means unstoppable. It's inevitable that it will keep moving. And greedy web, well, a web is made to catch flies or other small insects, to be killed and eaten. It's greedy for those flies because it's hungry to eat. The image of the web mixes with the image of the spider. What is being described here? Well, actually, it's the city with its streets and its alleyways. The cities, the way that the streets and the alleyways fling themselves out reminds him of the legs, the 8 legs of the spider that he's running around in. Somehow he's been eaten and is now inside this horrible monster, which is the city itself. And he's talking about the monstrous city being in the middle of a web, the web being a trap into which perhaps our hero has fallen. This is a particularly strange and maybe even mad image, and perhaps that tells us quite a lot about the mental state of the poor narrator, who is such a terrible situation. He has to find the girl, but he's being chased by a murderer, and those two things make him feel trapped and endangered and thinking about the closeness of death. That's what the images might mean. But what are those images? Well, hopefully you spotted these, that like a thief in the night, with no hiding place, is a simile. It's a simile because it uses the words like, and it's drawing a simple comparison between the thief and the narrator. He isn't a thief, but he's in a similar situation. The maze of the old city is a metaphor because the old city is being said to have those characteristics of the maze. And that last one is quite difficult to categorize. It was as if does sound like a simile, and it does start as a simile. But then it becomes what we could call an extended metaphor. Having introduced the idea of being inside the impossible body of an enormous hollow spider, it then talks about him being lost in the legs and that the spider is crawling across the surface of the web. These extensions to the image, all of which are in line with the initial idea of the spider, actually make it much more complicated and much more sophisticated. There's an element here of zootropism too, because the city and the streets have been turned into, in the metaphor, into a big spider. And when you talk about an object as if it were an animal, when it isn't an animal, we can call that zootropism. Some would argue that this particular image is so over the top that it becomes exaggerated for effect, and that would be hyperbole, which is exaggerating for creative effect. Maybe just to show how crazy and paranoid the narrator has become. Does imagery add anything to the story? Well, let's have a look at paragraph 2 and take some of that imagery out and see what it reads like. Suddenly, I was running. I didn't want to be caught, so I went quickly along the winding, complicated roads. There were different pathways going in every direction. I was lost and confused. Is this better? Well, it does depend on taste. Maybe it's better because it's less over the top and pretentious. Maybe it's better because it's more direct. It's up to you. However, I don't think examiners would think so. Remember, you're writing question 5 for an examiner, really. That's different from just writing a story for a general reader or for yourself. So, although there is a great virtue in simplicity, sometimes you do just have to show off your descriptive skills. And if that means going slightly over the top, well, so much the better if you can do it. So in this case, I think we have lost some of the vivid imagery of the original. You don't feel his paranoia and his fear. You don't feel the danger of those roads and back streets. So I think perhaps this isn't as good as the original. Let's think about how you would go about creating imagery. Well, imagery can be created from very simple language. Let's look at the picture. Maybe you've got a picture as a stimulus, maybe you're just trying to think of describing something that you've got in your mind. But we'll take this tree. And I could just say, there was a tree in front of me. Well, that doesn't give us very much to work with. There was a tree in front of me. Now what you do is you just try and think of any words or phrases that pop into your mind when you either look at the picture or you think about the tree. Don't worry about them, just let them come. What's obvious about the tree? Don't spend too long thinking about it, just let them come naturally. See if you can come up with some words and phrases that might go with that picture of the tree. Well, here's some that I came up with. Ugly, giant, scary, eyes like a demon, gaping mouth with teeth. So here's the eyes and the mouth. You could go further. It's got these arms stretching out to grab you. Maybe this is a beard, or even it's throwing up some green ivy vomit that's gone down his front of his shirt. You could go to town on it. You could get a whole paragraph or even a whole page out of describing this tree. So you gather together in your mind or even in your plan on the side of your piece of paper just some words and phrases and try and put them into sentences. So here I've rearranged them into a descriptive sentence. There was a giant, ugly tree in front of me, scary eyes like a demon with a gaping mouth full of teeth. Now, that was quite simple. It was just based on thinking about the picture, coming up with some words, and then rearranging them into a sentence. But now what I've got is a really detailed, evocative set of imagery. The tree now comes to life. It's got eyes and a mouth, and it's like a giant. It's scary. It's evil. The word demon evokes the word evil. You feel fear for this tree. You imagine it might jump out at the narrator. Maybe you go on to talk about its arms stretching towards you, and it's poised to pounce. It's guarding the entry to the forest. It now becomes a character, this tree, in a fantasy or maybe a horror story. And that's all done simply with just thinking about some of the keywords that could go with the picture. You get a blank creatively, just take a pause, take a breath, and just write random words, and then you can choose a few of them to carry on with your sentence. Never panic, just take a pause and just jot down some of your thoughts. What type of imagery is there? Now, immediately you should come up with a few $10 words, right? And I'm thinking along the lines of similes, metaphors, personification, onomatopoeia. These are all types of imagery, and we will look at some of them in a moment as revision. So you're quite right if you thought of those. One of the simplest forms of description using a language device is the simile. A simile is a figure of speech or language device in which two fundamentally unlike things are explicitly compared, usually in a phrase introduced by like or as. The key thing here is explicitly compared. You are actually saying that this thing is like another thing. The cleverness comes in choosing things which are actually different. There's no point in saying, a satsuma is like an orange. Well, that doesn't really work because a satsuma is an orange, really, isn't it? So that's not really a simile. A simile comes from taking one thing which is not like the other thing in most ways, but maybe in one or two ways it is. For example, the cat was like a murderer in the night. Now, a cat is not a murderer because a murderer is a human being who goes around and deliberately kills other people. But the idea of the cat being a killer, we understand because cats do catch mice and birds, and they are very good at killing smaller animals. And they do tend to hunt at night. So they're out there in the dark, which is creepy. And the idea of a murderer skulking around creepily at night, might give you the shudders if you're thinking about a crime thriller or a horror story. So although murderers and cats are very different, in those ways they are quite similar, and it sort of gives some of the evil and nastiness of the murderer to the cat in the picture that the person is trying to create. But similes don't always work straightforwardly. Perhaps with the murderer there aren't many other connotations. But with some words there are, so you have to be quite careful with similes when you're building them. So this is a bit of fun from the film Shrek, in which Shrek puts forward the idea that ogres are like onions. Well, as you can see, Donkey has some fun here because onions can have lots of different connotations. Ogres are like onions. They stink? Yes. No. They make you cry? No. You leave them out in the sun and they get all brown and start sprouting little white hairs? No. Layers. Onions have layers. As you can see here, the fact that onions have different connotations means that on its own is not a particularly useful simile. Maybe Shrek should have said, ogres are like onions because they have layers. That would have taken out any confusion and would have worked better as a descriptive simile here. Remember, be careful with similes because you always have to remember the banana lady. Yes, here she is, the banana lady. Look, imagine the lady's being described coming down a beautiful flight of stairs to a sophisticated dinner or a masked ball or something, and you want to describe the elegance of her beautiful dress. And you say, she wore a dress as yellow as a banana. It isn't going to work, is it? Why doesn't it work? Well, the connotations surrounding bananas go well beyond their colour, their yellow colour. I mean, they're undeniably yellow, but there are other things about bananas which drive out the colour, particularly the shape. What we tend to see is a woman who looks like a banana, and that isn't a sophisticated, elegant image, it's a comic image. Partly that's due to the fact that bananas have a, how should we say, a Freudian connotation, and that doesn't help when you're trying to build up an image of a beautiful evening gown. So do remember the banana lady when you're creating your simile, because you wouldn't want to go too far in that direction. Metaphors are a more sophisticated form of image because they can go way beyond simple comparison. So a metaphor is a figure of speech or a language feature in which there is an implied comparison made between two unlike things that actually have something in common. So in order to describe one thing, you use a connection to a different thing which has some features in common, but is usually unlike. So if we go back to the cat and the murderer, instead of saying the cat is like a murderer in the night, we say the cat stalked the back alleys with his murderous tools concealed in soft fur. Well, we're now saying the cat is a murderer. We're talking about the tools, obviously. The tools in this case are the claws of the cat, but in the metaphor they become the guns and the knives of the murderer. The soft fur, obviously, is the pads on the paws of the cat. A metaphor expresses the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar, or it draws our attention to something surprising about the object being described by likening it to some aspect of something else. So in the case of the cat, we're likening it to the murderer because cats kill. And that's maybe a different way of thinking about a cat than from the purring pussycat sitting on your lap. Let's have a look at what you could do simply with love is a rose. Now, if you say love is a rose, Neil Young's song, Love is a Rose, he might be saying that love is alive. A rose is a growing, living thing. Love grows. Love is beautiful. A rose is a beautiful flower, and love is beautiful, but not in the same way as a flower. A flower is beautiful because of the way it looks or the way it smells. Love is beautiful on an abstract level. So the beauty that we're talking about there is a different level and a different type of beauty, but nevertheless, we can make that comparison. On the other hand, in contrast, love can hurt you. So a rose has thorns. So although it's beautiful, if you hold it in the wrong way, it can cut open your finger and it can cause you pain. Likewise, as many of us know, a loving relationship is wonderful, but sometimes when you give your heart to someone, that means you're more vulnerable to be hurt. But again, the pain you feel emotionally is not the same as the pain you feel when you prick your finger. We're using that idea of hurt metaphorically, as well as the comparison between love and hurt. There are many more things, and of course the person who uses a metaphor like that may mean all of them or some of them all at the same time, which allows metaphors to be used in a much more sophisticated way than similes. The differences between metaphors and similes, just remind ourselves, writers sometimes use similes and metaphors to help create vivid images in our minds. A simile compares two things using the words like or as. My father grumbles like a bear in the mornings. We're not saying that your father is a bear, just that he makes noises like a bear, and maybe he has a sore head in the morning. A metaphor also compares two things, but it does not use the word like or as. My father is a bear in the mornings, grumbling and growling. So here we're actually suggesting that father has transformed into a bear, and we can now see the image of him grumbling and growling around the house. It's an exaggerated image, and it's a comic image because we almost see the bear, but we don't think he really has become a bear. That's how metaphors work. So which is which of these two? Metaphor or simile? I put metaphor of simile. I do beg your pardon. Good friendship is like coffee, rich and warm and strong. Men's words are bullets that their enemies take up and make use of against them. Which of those is a metaphor and which of those is a simile? Were you right? Obviously, good friendship is like coffee. Like means it's a simile. So it's just the nature of coffee that it's rich and warm and strong. Those words mean one thing when you're talking about coffee, and they mean a completely different thing when you're talking about friendship. But nonetheless, it's a clever comparison. Men's words are bullets. So the words, the language used by men is being turned into, in the metaphor, the physical bullets that enemies can pick up and put in their guns and fire back. Something's being said about the fact that your enemies will use what you've said against you as weapons against you. And that's being made physical by understanding those words as bullets that the enemies can use. And that's a metaphor because we're not using like or as, and it gets a little bit more sophisticated by thinking of the ways in which a bullet can be picked up and shot back. That's a way of making the idea of using your words against you a much more concrete image, and it's a well done metaphor. But there are other types of image, and we've talked about some before. We talked about zootropism, which is actually just a form of metaphor. It's just a specific making the comparison of a thing that isn't an animal to an animal, or maybe a human being to an animal, like a father being turned into the bear. Then you have the more common personification, which is to do with making a thing that isn't a person into a person. And that would be like saying that the sky was frowning. Well, that suggests that there's going to be bad weather, but the sky doesn't frown, it doesn't have a face, and it doesn't have any emotions. That's really the sky being turned into a person in the image, and we call that personification. A very common one, and I like it because it's a sound image, is onomatopoeia, where the words are used to imitate the sounds the reader would hear if you were really there. So bang, crash, whisper, crackle, fizz. Whisper's a good one because if you just think about it, he whispered. Whisper, 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 whisper. It does actually sound like what you hear if you hear people whispering and you can't actually hear what they're saying. You just hear that whisper, 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 whisper sort of noise, and that is exactly what it sounds like, the word whisper. So words have been made up simply to mimic the sound of them, which I think is great fun. And onomatopoeia can be used to bring your piece of writing to life so that we can hear what's going on, as well as just reading about it. Another one is rich description. That's what the examiners want in question 5 on both papers, lots of rich description. You do not have to use these fancy linguistic devices like metaphors and similes and onomatopoeia. You don't have to use them. It's good if you can use a couple, but you can get very high marks just using language carefully and excitingly. So you can use simple adjectives and adverbs. Look at this description from the story. I saw the red leather of her high-heeled shoes. I breathed in their musty, new from the shop perfume. Adjectives and adverbs. Just using describing words can be incredibly effective. Examiners will give you loads of marks for the effective use of straightforward description. Images can be created very simply. All imagery is actually about the words themselves, which is a big note for the language analysis question, where of course you are talking about language, you are talking about the words. We create imagery out of words. It's only words that we have to use. And so when you are taking apart the imagery to try and explain it, you need to talk about words. Which brings us back to that wheelbarrow. Remember, words on the page. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. How does the writer create his image? Well, look at the words that I've highlighted. Red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, white chickens. Simple adjectives. Red, white, glazed. You can see the red, you can see the white, and glazed, you can see that as well. There is a colour contrast at the heart of the poem. Red versus white. The redness of the wheelbarrow, the whiteness of the chickens. And that has a contrast. Okay? The whiteness is heightened by the redness is heightened by the whiteness. That's how contrast works. And finally, in the middle, you have a visual effect, glazed. To be glazed is to be shiny and reflective. So you have a shiny reflectiveness between the redness and the whiteness. And that is how a rather beautiful but very simple visual image is created using those words. So we're left with a question about this poem. It's a much less simple poem than you might imagine. William Carlos Williams was a poet of an early 20th century school of poetry called the Imagists. That's the Imagists. So you can imagine that the image is very important to this type of poet. They were looking at peeling away all the excess words and you know the sort of the traditional trappings of poetry in order to simply focus on creating images. And the image, of course, that he creates here is quite vivid and in many ways very simple. You have this balance between the red wheelbarrow and the white chickens and that mysterious glaze that comes from the rainwater. And that image itself is, as we imagine, it's very simple. However, there is a question which has to be asked. What depends on the wheelbarrow? It says so much depends on a red wheelbarrow. Exactly what depends on that red wheelbarrow? And that's a question that I've been asking myself and hopefully answering in different ways ever since I first encountered this poem, maybe 35 years ago or whatever it was. And I'd like to ask you that question. I'm not going to give you an answer because I think everybody has to come up with their own answer. What depends on the red wheelbarrow? And if you remember that you're talking about a poem, you're talking about words on the page, but you're also talking about an image in your mind, and you may even be talking about a real red wheelbarrow in a real farmyard with real chickens. On what level does anything depend upon that red wheelbarrow? Something to think about, something to meditate on. So thank you for listening, and I hope that's put some thoughts in your head about using and talking about imagery. There are some things you can do, you can take away and maybe want to get back to me on. One, you could read through that story again, the race. The actual full text is available on Covlearn, so you don't have to read it in this presentation. Read through the story again and identify some of the metaphors, similes, and other effects. Can you explain them? Maybe you'd like to highlight them and choose a few to write about as if you were doing a language analysis. Another thing you could do is write a description of your own. Try to use as much imagery as you can. You could perhaps answer one of the questions from your textbook, or you might have a past paper, or just choose a picture and write a little description or a little story about it. And finally, you might have a go at answering my question. What depends on that red wheelbarrow? And any of those you could email to me at the email address there, graham.sutherland@coventry.gov.uk. Remember to spell Graham correctly, no H's. And I will respond to anything I'm sent. So if you email me something to mark, I will get back to you by email. So thank you very much for listening. Keep healthy. All the best. Bye.